Before I begin, I'll share just a couple of procedural things. You'll notice that the chat function has been disabled. However, throughout the presentation, please use the Q&A function to pose questions to our speakers. And we will make plenty of time at the end of their presentation to answer any questions that come up for you. You'll also notice that in the chat and on the screen, there will be a link and a QR code to a survey. Please go ahead, take the survey, let us know what you like and what you'd like to see from future webinars. I do want to let everyone know that this webinar is being recorded and will be posted to Ava's YouTube channel shortly. That means you can revisit and share this webinar and all of our previous webinars. After the introduction, I'll post that link in the chat. Welcome to the Alliance Against Violence in Universities Webinar Wednesdays. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Yursich. With Ava, I'm an early career researcher and lead on the webinar series, and outside of that, I'm the co-director of the Frida Center for Research on Violence Against Women and Children, housed in the School of Criminology at Simon Fraser University. I'm joining you today from the unceded traditional and ancestral territory of the Coquitlam First Nation, and on behalf of AVA, which is a national organization. I want to begin by acknowledging that we encourage all Canadians and visitors to Canada to learn about the Indigenous peoples of the lands on which they live, work, or visit, and become engaged allies together. We as Canadians, in the spirit of truth and reconciliation, respect the self-determination of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and their rights and responsibilities in cultures, languages, and the pursuit of wellness. The focus of today's webinar is sexual and gender minority experiences of intimate partner abuse and help seeking, insights from a systematic review. And I'm so excited that we're joined today by Dr. Zack Marshall and Noah Ulicki from the University of Calgary. Dr. Marshall is an associate professor and graduate program director in the Department of Community Health Sciences at the University of Calgary. With transdisciplinary training in psychology, social work, and community health, Zack is passionate about how we can leverage research for transformation or transformative social change. His current projects focus on meta-science, or research on research, evidence synthesis, and the ethics of research with individuals and communities who experience structural oppression. Noah is a research assistant at the University of Calgary. He is currently pursuing his MSc in Disability Studies, Rights and Inclusion at the University of Leeds. His research addresses community-identified needs in both the 2S LGBTQIA+ community and the disability community, with emphasis on intersectionality. Zack and Noah, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yay, thank you very much for such a wonderful introduction. Noah and I are super happy to be here today, and I'm very excited that I heard the correct pronunciation of Ava because I kept calling it AVA. So this is very good for my brain. Hopefully I will remember for the rest of today. So thank you so much to folks who are here joining us. Noah and I are going to be sharing this presentation. I'm going to do the first chunk, then Noah will do the second chunk, and then I will do a piece towards the end before we have time for Q&A. We're really interested in the questions you may have, and I admit that the third part, a lot of it is about some of our questions, learnings, sort of musings from doing this work and the things we've been learning sort of conceptually and methodologically that I think I find particularly interesting. So we'll see if you do as well. So yeah, let's move forward here. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about the background to this project and the history before getting into some of our findings. And Noah's going to present a very specific part of our results. So, for people who don't or do know, 2S LGBTQI people experience IPA or intimate partner abuse at similar or higher rates than heterosexual non-trans counterparts. There's been a huge amount of research demonstrating that over time. And we also know that the service access barriers are well established in the existing literature, but we don't know as much about why, in the sense of like what is the trajectory when people attempt to access help or attempt to access services, what happens. And so this review that we worked on and seem to continue to work on examined the help seeking experiences of sexual and gender minorities who are exposed to IPA, including service contact and access. And so that's been very much the lens that we brought to this, as you'll see. The research objectives were to identify knowledge strengths and gaps related to intimate partner abuse and to us LGBTQI people, to describe the help seeking efforts and experiences of people who've both experienced and or used IPA, including interactions with informal and or formal supports. And Noah's going to talk a lot more about the informal supports piece. We tend to use the terms experienced abuse or used abuse in an effort to be destigmatizing. And because we know that in 2S LGBTQI communities or sexual and gender minority communities, there's also a high there are high rates of what we might call mutual abuse or abuse where both partners might demonstrate abusive behaviors towards each other. And so we really have tried to think about how to talk about this while also attempting to be clear. So, but we tend to stay away from terms such as victim. And perpetrator in our work. But yes, if you would like to talk about that in the Q&A, that would absolutely be welcome. Um, it is always a bit of a juggle with also wanting to be very clear with people and also to support accountability and people taking responsibility for their actions. So a lot of layers to this work. We also really wanted to identify evidence-based recommendations to enhance service responsiveness to our communities. And so a little bit about how this came to be. I can't believe it, but I've been working on this for, I guess, almost 8 years now. But I actually was my own history in relation to this topic goes back quite a bit further because early in my career, I volunteered and also worked in the sort of sexual assault services realm. Way back at McGill at the sexual assault there was a student-run sexual assault support services program called SACOMS. And even in the early 90s, doing that work, we started to talk about abuse in lesbian relationships and trying to raise awareness. And so that was some of the early work that we were doing at that time in Montreal. And that was part of a broader context of work that was happening then. And later I worked in a shelter. So I mention these things because I bring that history. And when I was formerly a faculty member at McGill, there was an MSW student, Jessica Whitehead, who wanted to do her independent study project looking at help seeking with sexual and gender minority populations in relation to intimate partner abuse. And so that's really how that got started. And Jessica remains involved to this day. And then after Jessica's initial work on this, we tried to publish the we tried to publish the results of her review. And like many reviews, when it got to the journal, they were interested, but they said that we needed to update the search. And so that led to some work with Renee Peltikian, who was an MSW practicum student at the time at the University of Waterloo, and a postdoc, Dr. Richard Henry, who was at McGill, who really supported the updates of the review at that time. In I came to the University of Calgary in 2022, and when I did, there was a call from SSHRC, and it was actually jointly funded between SSHRC and WAGE for knowledge synthesis grants focused on intimate partner violence or gender-based violence. And I said, oh, well, this might be a great opportunity for us to further update this and finally get the results of this review out. It was a very quick turnaround time. I think we had 6 months that we had to have our initial results ready for the funders. So if we hadn't done all that work in the previous 5 years, it would have been very difficult. But that funding, which was for $30,000, really made it possible for us to bring this forward and involve a lot more people. And since then, We've had some great research practicum students from University of Calgary, and also research assistants, people like Noah, working on this to update and attempt to share the findings. So on this next slide, you see a whole bunch of names there on the right-hand side, including our co-investigators, collaborators from community and social service organizations, and all of the research assistants and placement students who have been involved over the last 8 years. And definitely thanks to our funders that really did make this possible. I think before that, with it being a student project, we just couldn't keep up with the volume and keep our screening up to date so that we could have up to date findings when we wanted to try to publish. So yeah, it's been a really interesting experience in that regard. And I should also thank the librarian we work with, because I'm going to talk about searches in a little bit. Martin Morris is a great librarian from McGill who's really supported this work, as I mentioned, the postdoc we worked with, Richard Henry, Kate Maurer, and Alan Santinelli Martino. So we'll just move forward here. So when thinking about the sources, we did a really comprehensive search of, as you can see here, multiple databases in the health and social science areas, and our search strategy itself focused on 2S LGBTQIA communities, which we've done a lot of reviews and evidence maps in that area. So we're fortunate to have a well-developed population level search strategy, and have actually developed a search filter for trans research, if you would ever like to see that. A little plug. And then the other part of the search was about the services that were available. We didn't focus so much on help seeking as part of the search string. We decided we would look into that once we got into the search results. So the search is up to date to November of last year, and we didn't have any language restrictions on that. I have to show you a Prisma flow diagram, because what would this be? We can't do reviews without these. Without, some people say don't present that. That's too much detail, but hopefully it will appeal to you. So far, we've screened 11,805 records. 2,913 went through to be screened on full text. And from that group, we've identified 1,110 studies about 2S LGBTQ intimate partner abuse. Today, we're focusing really in on the results from original research about SGM, IPA, and help seeking. So that gray box over here, maybe this part here just shows you um, the ones that are not about help seeking is 709. And then these ones here are all about help seeking, but they don't quite fit the criteria. They might be reviews, dissertations, and or they're summarizing the perspectives of healthcare providers or other social service providers. So we've taken those out. So this batch here that we have 274 is really original research about 2S LGBTQ plus IPA and help seeking, which means that the in the study, the people who've experienced and or used IPA have to have reached out or attempted to reach out to access service. So we tend to stay away from the ones that are like hypothetical vignette studies. We don't include those. This is really people who have concretely tried to access help. And that could be from formal or informal support. So you see here the numbers that give you a little bit of a sense of how popular are these different areas in terms of research. We in our work haven't focused as much on police corrections or the legal side of things. And some students last year started to look at healthcare experiences, but that was kind of an early days. Early days, we just started to try to even just categorizing what we meant by healthcare experiences and the types was something that they focused on. But really, as you'll see here, when we did the initial review, Stefan Karetfinsky, who recently finished his PhD here in our program, he made this really helpful diagram, which sort of looks at how helpful were these different types of services. So we have from least helpful, sadly, shelters, and police were on the less helpful end of things. Doctors slash healthcare, in this is from the original review results, so this hasn't not been updated yet, but they were seen as more mixed experience, and then more positive experiences were had with counselors, sort of like mental health services, and then the most positive with family, friends, and peers. And again, Noah's going to talk about that in a bit. So yes, we decided to focus on the family, friends, and peers, counselors, and shelters because, well, we thought it would be good to let people know what was working or what seems to be working well. But also the shelters piece is one that is, I guess I found personally, really disturbing to see how negative people's experiences were with the shelters, and also just in many cases, there's a complete lack of possibility of access. And so that is something we wanted to talk about. And it's sort of an interesting juxtaposition with the fact that there are many, many guides out there. If you look online, you're going to find many, many guides about how to improve shelters to make them more welcoming, but there's definitely a mismatch there. So we wanted to highlight that. So the paper on counseling and the mental health experiences has been published actually. The one on friends, family, and peers, it is so close. Noah is like, we're just getting to the final stages of that one. And the shelters one is one that we are still working on the analysis, but we are, yeah, we're getting there. So those are the ones we've really where we've put most of our energy, as I said, with some of the students as well, focusing on healthcare last year. So I'm gonna turn it over to Noah now to talk about some of the specific findings related to informal supports. And Noah, you can just say to me, switch slide anytime. I'm happy to do that.
Sure, yeah. Thank you, Zach. So in our review, we identified that overall, informer supports are reported as positive, but we were lacking more detailed information. So that's something we decided to dive deeper into. We know that research on intimate partner abuse has identified intimate partner abuse as a community concern rather than just a concern between two partners. And we also know that informal support is already present in the 2S LGBTQ plus communities. Next slide, please. So, to look at this topic, we really use the literature on collective care. In a nutshell, collective care is driven by and organized by and for the community. It's built on horizontal interactions. So, rather than doctor, patient, or police victim, we see peer to peer, person to person, kind of even playing field there. Um, Collective care really does come from the community, especially BIPOC feminist care spaces. So when we're looking at it, we're not looking at literature written by and for academics. We're really looking at community work and resources written by and for the community, such as some of the books pictured here. Care Work and Mutual Aid by Dean Spade were really important resources. Collective care acknowledges the necessity of interdependence and shared care in our survival as individuals and in community. This perspective creates avenues for expanding access to informal support and strengthening existing supports by fostering community-driven solutions. Next slide, please. So when we look at sources of support, there's not really a uniform definition of informal supports across the literature. So we pulled out kind of the informal supports that were talked about the most often. This includes family, so parents, children, and other relatives. And family is often the first point of contact, but relationships with family can be complicated. People may not experience support for their identity or may not have a relationship with parents or other family members. This means that friends come up next, and friends are reported to be a major source of support, often accounting for the majority of an individual's help-seeking network. We also see peers, so people you may not consider friends, but you interact in the same spaces, you see each other on a regular basis. And building off of friends and peers, roommates are in really unique positions because whether or not they consider themselves friends, peers, acquaintances, they are cohabitating with the individual or maybe the partner or a combination thereof. So they can be in a really unique position to interact and provide support. And then finally, we see identity-specific groups, so focused on gender, sexuality, or other aspects of a person's identity, such as ethnicity and disability status. Next slide, please. So barriers and facilitators do come up in the literature quite a bit. For barriers, we really see misconceptions of intimate partner abuse. So loved ones may offer advice that overlooks the complexities of same-sex relationships, or may not understand abuse in relationships between people in the 2S LGBTQIA plus community, or think that it doesn't exist. We also see negative reactions to disclosure. So silence, disbelief, victim blaming, gaslighting, these can all be experienced as an additional act of violence. We also feel isolation. So enough that families, there can be element of family rejection, and isolation in community, and this reduced support. Finally, systemic and structural barriers. So even if you are accessing informal supports, individuals do hold concerns about reports being made from those informal supports to more formal sources like the police. And this is a concern that's held quite a bit, especially by transgender and gender diverse people who are experiencing abuse. Next slide, please. On the flip side, we do see the facilitators, so empathetic and non-judgmental supports, as well as trusting relationships. Validation, outrage, being believed, empathetic listening, talking, patience, understanding, were all valued in the help-seeking process. We also know that practical supports are something that individuals report being really desired as an act of care. So offering shelter, housing assistance, resources, or a distraction from the current situation. And then shared experiences and open dialogue. So talking to someone who holds the same identity, has similar experiences, or someone you can engage in conversation with, rather than having someone talk to you or just talking to someone. Next slide, please. When we talk about care, the spaces that this care is occurring is really important, I personally believe. So location and spaces can help or hinder the help-seeking process, and locations can be or feel limiting. There are reports from rural communities that there could be challenges meeting other individuals. People may be more likely to encounter discriminatory attitudes, or if the 2S LGBTQ plus community is really small and you're dating someone within that community, it can be hard to find support within the same community. These same experiences have been reported in suburban environments as well. Because of this, people may relocate as part of the healing and help-seeking process. Community spaces have the potential to increase support and understanding in community. So common everyday spaces like libraries, group gathering spaces, bars, coffee shops can really be leveraged as a place for support. And there's a desire for dedicated community spaces that may be identity specific, may be focused on peer support, somewhere where this support and care can occur. And then on the topic of spaces, there's also online spaces. So forums and social media can be a space for support for individuals as well. And then next slide, please. So family, friends, and other community members may want to provide support, but feel unprepared to do so. Support networks encounter challenges, not having the capacity or knowledge to support, or they may facilitate assistance or accountability in a way that harms the community as a whole. For example, exclusion of the individual using abuse without any further action. There's also a lack of organized response or action. This may be from activism fatigue, a lack of awareness, or not wanting to get involved in matters that you're not personally impacted by. Overall, support and education to be supportive is desired. You think about education on providing support, but also education on self-care for the individuals and community providing support, as well as education on accountability processes in community. Some desired educational kind of tasks include events focused on learning about intimate partner abuse in the community, as well as scripts or suggestions for bringing up concerns. Next slide, please. So what's next? To develop research, we really need to formally define informal supports through a definition or framework. This can be challenging because some things are in a gray area. Is peer support formal or informal? And where do you draw that line? But without looking at informal supports as a concept, we're not able to make much progress. But really, what needs to come next with this knowledge is fostering connection and community support. And we know that community support is experienced as a positive support in the help-seeking process. But what can we do to make it better? And we need to work with community as literature and research develops to really enhance the supports that are available.
Thanks so much, Noah. The I want to go back for a minute to the this piece here about the findings because I wanted to tell you a little bit about our recommendations. And they're going to resonate well with what Noah's just been talking about. So there were 8 recommendations that came out of the review that was funded through Shirk and Wage. And so one thing that was very clear when we saw the findings was that critical changes are needed to gender-based violence services, particularly violence shelters, to properly respond to 2S LGBTQ communities. Many of the services perpetuate gender norms and engage in discriminatory actions that impede people's accessing adequate support, including a significant service gap for both cis and trans male identified individuals. Basically, the violence sector shelters are not accessible to male identified or people who identify as men. And so where should we be sending them? Where should they go? How can they access service when they are experiencing violence? The second thing was, as you can see here, so many people had negative experiences with police, and in fact, might even experience violence from police when reporting. So ensuring justice for 2S LGBTQI people who experience violence is essential, necessitating attention to the formal legal systems, policing, and transformative justice models. This can be particularly challenging in the context of children. So let's say you have a lesbian couple with children. If one of them is reporting violence, this also increases the likelihood that they will come to the attention of the child welfare system. And when we layer homophobia on top of that, as well as other forms of intersecting oppressions, as Noah talked about, that can really put people more at risk and reduce their likelihood of reporting at all. As we mentioned, counseling services are a strength and a valuable outlet for SGM community members. We recommended stronger support to this sector, including measures to reduce individual costs and to increase accessibility and equity. And then there's some points here about training and awareness, because one of the barriers that we saw from the literature is that many people who are experiencing IPA do not see themselves as experiencing abuse. So they don't necessarily label what they're experiencing as abuse, and therefore they don't think about where they could access IPA supports. Now, that could be because of who is sort of typically seen or typically portrayed as someone experiencing IPA. And it could also be because what violence and abuse looks like in queer relationships could be very different than what people are sort of used to seeing or have been told is abuse. And so the idea of increasing education and training, such as bias workshops, are needed for service providers, because obviously the service providers are bringing the same lens to this, but also needs to happen for people who are from queer and trans communities, because, as I said, they don't necessarily recognize what they're experiencing as abuse, and neither do their peers. So that can be another layer to it. So, and Noah talked about that as well. So, the piece about having some kind of educational curricula in schools or more inclusive curricula in schools, that could be adapted to include 2S LGBTQ IPA, could make a difference, enabling individuals to recognize experiences of abuse and better support one another. The other 3 are, as Noah's talked about, informal supports from friends is a crucial resource, and its effectiveness could be enhanced by establishing stronger connections with collective care initiatives. We saw some gaps as well in terms of how this is funded and evaluated, how this work is funded and evaluated. So people designing research and services need to meaningfully integrate intersectional frameworks that better respond to the full diversity of SGM communities. And part of that is this aspect of the way results are reported. We tried to do an intersectional analysis and we did our best with it. But when you're thinking about diversity within 2S LGBTQI communities. So we have sexual and gender, we have sexual diversity, we have gender diversity, then we also have other aspects of people's diversities, whether that relates to ethnicity, disability, income, where they're located, if they're in a rural versus urban areas, level of education, etc. All those pieces are interconnected, but very hard for us to really do um, a comprehensive intersectional analysis because there would be a study that might say we're going to look at racialized lesbian women in rural areas. So we would have that. But even when we look at or if we look at the results using the word racialized and lesbian, but if we go down into it to look at the diversity within, we would have a lot less information about which exact ethnic groups, who's coming from which groups. So that piece about because of the way the original study results are reported, it makes it very difficult for us to report intersectionality when doing evidence synthesis in this area. And the other thing that we identified is an urgent need for some kind of collective impact model that really addresses abuse prevention, coordinated service navigation pathways, evaluation of these informal and formal supports, and shared values, including sort of, as I mentioned, an intersectional lens, a trauma-informed care, and funding. It's very easy for us to criticize the way, for example, services are being offered in shelters. But if the funding model says the only people we will fund you to provide services for is this group, then it's very difficult. It's as I said, it's easy for us to critique, but without the proper resources, the system will not be able to change. And so there has to be the will to make a difference to people who in our communities who are experiencing abuse. So I just wanted to highlight those recommendations for you so that you could see them. They're also in our report that we put out. But now I'll jump ahead. I think we're doing pretty well on time. I want to go into some of the broader insights. This is a little bit more of the nuances that I think as researchers and providers might really interest you. Definitely things that we saw as an issue. So this is an active field of study. I would say highly active. It's very hard for us to keep our reviews current. These numbers here, so in from the January 2023 search, there were 703 studies about 2S LGBTQIA. But already by June 2024, from that search, that jumped to 923 studies on the general topic of 2S LGBTQIA. And then from our November search, we're up to 1,110 studies on this topic. So this is a huge number of studies. And we're actually hoping to post, we have another site, a database called Nosy, which includes 2S LGBTQ systematic reviews and scoping reviews. And we use Epimapper for that so that we can share all of the studies with people. And so we're hoping to do the same for this data set because really all of you could be drawing on this information. We don't have it tagged super specifically at the moment. Right now, is it about help seeking? Is it not about help seeking? And the ones that are about help seeking, we have more detail in terms of the populations involved and the type of study and where it's conducted. But just for people to be able to access this and search it could be helpful because we've gone through all the trouble of at least knowing that they are on the right topic. So that's one thing, but it is definitely active and without additional funding, it is definitely a challenge for us to try to keep it up to date as a team. Then the next thing is that what we really wanted to do is identify some kind of navigation pathway. So we know in fields like I come previously from the HIV sector. So in the HIV world, we have like the HIV continuum of care, which has been really helpful in some ways to at least identify the steps in the continuum and where we need to put our resources in terms of, what's working well and what needs more attention. And so we don't have anything like that that I'm aware of. And even within the broader IPA help seeking world of work, we haven't been able to find anything like that. So if any of you here know of such a model, we would love to hear about it, because we looked and looked for it when we were starting this work. Something may now be available, but if we could map our results onto that kind of a pathway model, I think that would be extremely helpful. Even just to, I was going to show you here, even just to show you what we believe could be the areas uh, within the different within the different pathways. So if stage one is searching for services, I mean, sometimes I say stage one is identifying that you are experiencing abuse or that someone you know is experiencing abuse. So we do have some challenges there for sure in our communities. But then once you feel that you might need service or someone you know might need service, then it's about searching for the appropriate services. And how does that work? Where do we look? How do we look? And then there's the part about contacting, actually trying to make contact, what kind of services people reach out to, and what happens when people interact, sort of those initial stages of interaction when they're first reaching out, whether it's on the phone, by email, by text, chat, those type of things. What are people's experiences with contacting service? And then we have the piece about stage three, which is what are the responses when people do make contact beyond that initial piece about, I'd like to access service here, but then what happens? What happens next? And so these are just some ideas that we've had about this, and we've been trying to, at the very least, categorize the different studies that do exist into which stage they are addressing, so we could try to get a better sense of that. But beyond just number of studies addressing each stage, I think what would be much more helpful would be if we could see, okay, but how is it actually going? What is the quality of service at each of these stages and what needs to change? So those are the things that we're thinking about. And as I said, if you know of any pathway or navigation models, we would really welcome your collaboration. A few other things here. There's actually four other points. There's one I don't have on here, but I'll mention it as number 6. But we had a lot of issues with our search. So how can I explain? So what happened is that when we used the initial IPA search terms, we realized that when we would look at the reference lists from included studies, or when we looked at reviews and the studies they had included, we realized that we're missing things. And so we were trying to understand what is happening about our search. And so part of that is about the terms that, especially in gay and bi men's relationships, that they might use to refer to a partnership and or abuse. So someone might experience sexual assault from a partner, even a long-term partner, but that might not, the term in that article, or that the term that the person uses might not be intimate partner abuse or domestic violence. And so in the fact that people are using different language, we had to expand our search terms quite a bit. So that's why when we did the update, the second update, it took us a really long time because we had added sexual abuse, sexual assault, sexual violence, those type of terms to our search so that we could be more inclusive of where we were seeing a gap, particularly in relation to gay and bi men. This other piece is also very relevant, number 4. So what counts as an intimate partnership in sexual and gender minority communities needs to be carefully considered. We have had so many conversations about this in our own team. Because at the beginning, some of the folks on the team said, well, if this is not an established sort of long-term partnership, then that's not an intimate partnership. Therefore, that's not intimate partner abuse. And so we've had a lot of conversations about, well, does a hookup count as an intimate partnership? How casual can something be? Or how non-casual does something have to be for it to be considered an intimate partnership? And so this issue about a relationship is also very interesting when we think about the ways queer communities come together. And so I do feel that sort of the idea of what is an intimate partnership and an intimate partnership and an intimate relationship, um, sort of being originally defined or modeled based on sort of a cisgender heterosexual couples has done us a bit of a disservice in attempting to find work in this area in attempt to recognize these intimate partnerships and also then what abuse looks like within them and to be able for people to see themselves. So all of those pieces are quite complex. And even like I would say within the team and with other colleagues that I've talked to about this, sometimes they're like, no, that's not an intimate partnership, Zach. So we for a while we were saying, well, if the person is not a stranger, then it would count as an intimate partnership. But then we got into all these layers about, oh, so, well, what if it is someone who you don't know their name, but let's just say you hook up with them multiple times, would that count? So, like I said, it's complicated, and I think that needs to be a conversation within queer and trans communities, because I think for people as well who are not familiar with our relationship styles or relationship styles that people might be having in queer trans communities, it could be very, very confusing. And also, I can imagine quite a bit of potential judgment there about, well, should someone have three partners? You know what I mean? Is it okay? Like, what if they've been with, say, two partners for many years? Does that still count? And so yes, there's a lot here to unpack that we definitely bumped up against in doing this work. And as I said, even within our team, we had to go back and rescreen some of the early references because of the criteria that some folks had been using early on. Um, so Noah's alluded to this fifth part, but definitely perspectives in community that are circulating in community are not necessarily reflected in the literature. So we certainly see this with collective care, and we are hopeful that the collective care ideas will meet up with this area of work. But so far in the academic literature, we don't see it as much. And so hopefully in time, we know that we're always behind in academia, but that's a piece to think about. The other one that isn't on here, but that I keep thinking about and wanted to share with you is that when I worked in the shelter sector, there were a lot of lesbian, bi, queer women working in that area. And who were very involved in establishing shelters, establishing sexual violence supports and services in the community. And so I was interested in this idea that, okay, our communities have been involved in this work from the start, but yet the services have not been designed or accessible necessarily to us LGBTQ communities. So that's an interesting idea. But then when Noah and I and Mila and some others from the team went to look for that history, we really have not been able to find it. Not in books that we've found, not in the peer-reviewed literature, certainly. And so this is a bit of a question mark that I certainly have at the moment. And I reached out to some of the people who did original work in this area, like Janice Ristock comes to mind, for example, and there's a few other people whose names I don't have off the top of my head that I reached out to ask about this. And I think even the question can be a little bit hard to understand if you're not familiar with that early organizing. And then one of the people really kindly, Renzetti, there we go. Renzetti put me on to someone from the States who had just written, I think it was like a 2 or 3 volume history of organizing around intimate partner abuse and gender-based violence in the United States. And I was so excited because I thought, okay, now this person is really going to be able to help me, show me some of the documentation of this involvement. And when I talked to her by the email, I was asking about this and she said, Zach, I interviewed so many people, but I have to tell you, like, nobody that I talked to said they identified as lesbian or queer or bisexual. None of them. And so that part of the history, I would say, seems to be missing in terms of the work. And if I hadn't been involved in it myself, I wouldn't know. And so I think this is quite fascinating. The latest thinking that I have is that we were lucky to do a little bit of work with Fallon Roulier in Quebec from Montreal, who went to the a couple of different archives, the lesbian archives, but also the archives of the, oh my gosh, I think it's called the Lesbian Solidarity Network. I believe I could get you the name of it, but Fallon went to both of those locations to try to look for a little bit more of the organizing that had been done, at least in relation to violence in lesbian and bi women's communities in Quebec since the sort of 80s, 90s, and moving forward. So we do have some documentation of that, but my latest wish is to go and talk to some more people from archives about whether they're aware of any of the this histories of this organizing. But I do find that this is all for me related because how our histories of our community's involvement in this work and visibility in this work is part of the piece about how the services are organized, whether they're accessible or not, and whether we see a place for ourselves in the way this work is organized and in the supports that we can provide to our communities. So that to me is kind of like the sort of full circle piece that I'm trying to bring. Who knows if that will happen in my career, but it is something that I've been thinking a lot about lately, because that visibility piece is always part of the challenge when thinking about this topic. So I think we're pretty good on time there, Sarah. And so I'll just turn it back to you and see where we go from here. I'm super curious to hear people's responses, questions, etc.
Thank you both for such a powerful and important presentation. I know I learned a lot. I'm sure our audience did too. And I'll leave it open for the Q&A. Nothing has come in yet. But I was wondering, and I oftentimes ask a couple questions as we wait for people to gather their thoughts and ask questions. As you were doing this, what surprised you about the findings? Either good or bad surprise, but like what really came out? You're like, I was not expecting that.
Noah, do you want to go?
Ooh. Um, I think, well, I'm really interested in the informal support. So it was really interesting to me that really nobody's defining informal supports. People really just pick and choose what groups they'd like to talk about as they go. But I also think some of the reports on shelters weren't necessarily surprising, but to see them on paper and kind of the way it's manifesting in community was really interesting to me as well.
If I could follow up on that, what ways were they manifesting in community? I'd love to hear a little bit more.
Ooh, I think like a paper that sticks out to me was talking about transgender men, and it talked about how shelters would help them if the problems were related to being a woman, but not related to being a man. And thinking about how do you even separate those two out from a person, and when someone's seeking support, I think is really interesting and hard to read.
Absolutely. I I had not expected like that kind of thing to come out of this work because you think we'd be so much further along.
Yeah.
Does
There's
any
so many surprises, Sarah, I have to tell you. So many for me. I mean, I think partly it's the volume. The volume surprised me a little bit because sometimes a typical thing that people will say is like, "Oh, we just don't have enough research about this." You know what I mean? We don't have enough to know. Um, so that piece did surprise me, especially that volume about help seeking, because that's not just in general, but that volume about help seeking is good to know. I mean, I should be clear though, some of the things that are about help seeking, they are like one question from a survey. So the ones that are fully focused on help seeking is a smaller number. Um, for me, I think the other thing was the points that I was talking about um the idea of violence not being seen because and us not being able to find it because we're not using the right terms necessarily in our search really was helpful. And for me, the conversations about what is an intimate partnership, I find that's like one of the most fascinating things that came out of this for me. And we haven't been able to find a lot of great definitions either. So yes, if there's people here on the call that are like, "Oh, that's so obvious. It's right here. That's where you should be. You look right here. It's very obvious what intimate partner abuse is." Like that that for me was another really key piece because if we can't find it either and we're like looking and looking, but we're also I guess we are pushing a little bit at the boundaries of what might count. And then one of my good friends, like I was talking to him about, okay, if someone is in a bathhouse and they meet someone there, and then like let's just say they experience sexual violence, is that IPA? And my friend was like, no, that's not IPA at all. That's sexual assault. And then I was like, okay, so what? This is just again, I find it so fascinating because I'm like, okay, but what if you went to that same bathhouse every Sunday for a month or once a month for 6 months and you end up seeing that same person there and you hooked up with them? Or no, that wouldn't necessarily okay, yes, let's just say that you did. You
Yeah.
went there 6 times and you hooked up with them and things had gone well. And then all of a sudden, one of those times you experienced violence, something that is against your consent. Would that count?
I mean, that's a very good question because it redefines sort of what the relationship would have been if it's a once off or if it's a continued pattern or yeah. When you said that, it kind of that stood out to me when you're talking the webinar too. I was like, I thought there would be a not necessarily clean cut, but a clearer definition that would come out. Now, a
And
lot of
maybe there
our
is, like, there might be, Sarah,
yeah,
maybe there's people here that are like, oh, yes, well, if we were to think about like heterosexual couples and IPA, it means you have to be living together. I actually don't know. You know what I mean? For
yeah,
a certain period of time, uh,
yeah.
is there a definition?
No, it's still murky in that area as well. Some people come up with stronger definitions, but there's no amount of time, there's no frequency.
Mm.
And I wonder if people are worried about defining something so clearly or so narrowly that would leave something out. I don't know.
We would definitely be in big trouble in terms of like synthesizing it though, because the findings we don't have that level of detail from the studies. You
Yeah.
know what I mean? Like maybe they did interviews with people, but they're not going to say in the results table, you know what I mean, relationship
Yeah.
for this
Yeah.
period of time, blah 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 blah. Or are they going to make a I mean it is really fascinating
Yeah.
actually. And I know
Absolutely.
that my thinking about what is an intimate partnership is very different. Like I realized from some people on my team, because people are like, that's not intimacy.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
It's,
No, that's very true.
like that, and I'm like, isn't it?
Yeah, that's fair. I think maybe that's why it's murky is that if one person would define it as intimacy and someone else wouldn't, that you can't really put guardrails on that. I don't know.
Yeah, like someone else might just say, like my friend, no, that's just sexual behavior. That's not intimacy. So anyway, these are the things that I think
Yeah,
we end up really getting into in this work that's kind of more fundamental.
absolutely. And it's interesting when you do this kind of work, and the most surprising things are the very fundamental things you would have otherwise taken for granted rather than those big picture things where you're like, oh, there's this earth-shattering thing. You're like, but wait, why is something so foundational to our understanding not actually part of this?
Hmm.
Now, a lot of our audience who attends these and watches them after the fact are actually frontline service providers. Based on your research, are there some things that frontline service providers, that community service workers could do to help make folks like your research focused on safer or reduce barriers to help seeking, for example?
Hmm. Love this. Noah, do you have anything off the top in relation to your what you've been working on? Oh, Stefan is here. Stefan will have some ideas.
Here, hold on. Let me bring Stefan on.
Please bring him in. Thank you, Stefan.
Stefan, I'm so
Stefan
sorry to
is
put
the
you on the
lead.
spot.
Stefan is the lead author of a number of the publications from this, so this is very good news.
There we go.
Hey, hi. Sorry, I am on my couch, so I don't look good, and I accidentally put my hand up. I was just
All good. Okay.
really sure.
I was like,
But
oh,
did you
Stephanie
want
has
to
to put
talk
her
to this,
down.
Stefan? Because you probably have it off the top of your head.
Honestly, I was gonna say great job because I was gonna hop off here in a bit, but if you can repeat it, I could probably put in some input.
Yeah, absolutely. The question was about what advice or what recommendations or suggestions might we have for service providers?
Oh gosh, I mean that's very convoluted because yeah, this topic was so huge, so I guess it depends if you're so yes, like service providers working like in what kind of agency, what kind of setting, and who
Do you have the
exactly.
mental health one off the top of your head, or do you want to think about it? I don't know. I don't want to, like I said, I
Yeah,
realize we totally put you on the spot, Stefan.
no, that's okay. I think for the mental health one, from what I kind of remember from that review was just making sure that you're sort of like again using like caring language, not necessarily trying to describe the experiences of the individuals who are experiencing the IPB, but rather letting them sort of tell their story, and you're not necessarily trying to associate specific behavior or language on that. You just let them tell it how they want to. And then also just having resources within settings just to make these individuals know that, they are op like, it's an open space to talk about it. So if they do feel like they want to, instead of trying to pressure them to talk about it, just having those resources might be the first trigger to end up not make up, but like encourage them to speak. Or they might come back later to speak about it. Perhaps not that first session or second session, but later on.
That's so true, Stefan. Thank you. And you reminded me that I think there's a lot of I think there's a lot of beliefs about same gender violence. So, for example, like I think for many, many years, and maybe some people still do believe this, that women couldn't be violent, you know what I mean, or abusive to each other. And also that really went against like our early organizing efforts in the, violence against women sector, which was called earlier, right? So now in the gender-based violence sector, that the idea that women could be violent in relationships, or also just the minimization of, well, how bad could it be? You know what I mean? Which is super sexist, right? But this idea that, oh, well, it's women, so how bad could this abusive behavior be? So I think there's like this sexist misogyny that is woven in them that also sort of really delegitimizes the idea that women could be experiencing violence from a female partner. So there's that piece. And then there is another whole thing that has happened in this area where, for example, in the shelter sector, people were very worried that let's just say I'm again talking about women because women can mainly the only people who can cis women are the main people who can access shelters. So the workers were very worried that they would not be able to distinguish between the two partners and that they might both attempt to access service and they wouldn't know how to tell which person was sort of like the primarily abusive person, or if the abuse was bidirectional, but say one person it felt that it was more of a self-defense, but that the person who was maybe um I don't know if I would see, I don't know what language to use, primarily abusive or more dominantly abusive would be the one that ended up getting access to the shelter. And so that though became a really problematic piece because then people were like, oh well, we can't because we can't tell who's who. We can't really let either of them in because we could be letting abusers into the shelter. And so that piece has been very problematic. And sometimes it's like, okay, let's just use like what strategy would you normally use? You know what I mean? To try to like figure this out. If someone was coming to you, what questions would we be asking? And then using a similar logic really to thinking about how to go about this or coming up with a process. You know what I mean? That could help. But instead, I think what has happened and is that people have just been less likely to be able to access port period, right? And so that's been a really big piece. So the part about the stigma and the stereotypes is very present. And the other thing that's pretty complicated within all this is also say with men, so say gay, bi, queer men, is oh, there's a lot of layers there around masculinity, violence, authority, power, control in relationships. Like there's a whole bunch of layers there that we need to think about within communities, but also try to demystify with people who are not part of our communities or who are not aware. And then um, because we know for like gay, bi, queer men, being less likely to see what they're experiencing as abuse, then some of the literature suggests that people might be more likely to be seen when in emerge, basically, when they have such physical injuries. And so these approaches to screening in emergency departments was actually a place where we did start to see people. But then, of course, the screening tools have to be inclusive. Because if you're like, we ask all women, you know what I mean, if they've experienced this, then of course none of the men who are experiencing abuse will be caught in those, not caught, I mean, will be recognized in those screening with those screening tools. So yeah, I would say the other thing I think really for people who are service providers is just this barrier around your funding and what the funders are requiring and the rules that the funders are placing on who's eligible. I think that's one of the really big barriers. So to me that's why I was saying like the collective impact piece is so important because if as a sector people can come together because so often we're pitted against each other for the funding, right? It's like we're fighting over these little pots. If we could if there was enough will, you know what I mean, to come together to try to look at that. I think that would be another piece because it does need to be this isn't like a one worker issue. This is absolutely structural.
Absolutely. That is so well said, and I think such a powerful takeaway from all of the work about it's not just what single service providers can do, but actually what the system needs to change. We need to change assessment tools, we need to change funding models, we need to probably build more services tailored to non-cis women, for example, to men in general, let alone queer men or trans men. And
Mhm.
yeah, I think such a good point. Thank you. And I think that's a good spot to wrap up the Q&A. But if either of you have something I didn't ask that you want to add, please go ahead. I know there's probably a ton to say from your work.
No, do you have anything else? No, Stefan, you feel free to jump in if you want. I guess I would just say, like, in doing this work, we never do want to minimize, violence against cisgender heterosexual women. Like, we know that who is dramatically impacted by intimate partner abuse and violence, and we never want to minimize that by any means. It's not like we're never saying like, oh, there should be less services.
Oh, of course
No.
not.
Yeah, yeah, I just wanted to say it. We just would like more services that are more inclusive,
Oh,
and
absolutely.
yeah, yeah. I just
And
wanted to make sure to
no,
mention.
no, and I would love also, and this comes from personal perspective, for us to get to a point with gender-based violence services that we don't have to couch it in, well, we're not trying to take this away from cis women, rather than we just need more. Because I think that's
Hmm.
part of the problem that dominates why there are these barriers that you talk about is because we're so worried about saying we're not taking something away from this big problem, but we're saying there's so many huge gaps that need to be addressed that aren't. And
Yeah.
that's so important. Well,
Yeah, and
thank
I
you
think
both.
the Sarah, maybe one other
Yeah,
small thing I would
please.
just add is that when we see how sort of like intersectionality with the syndemics as well, when we see the interconnections between like child abuse, like child abuse or child sexual abuse, then people's um or adverse events in childhood. Looking at Stefan here, you know what I mean? When we're looking at that, when we're looking at mental health, we're looking at substance use, sexual health, HIV, like all of those pieces, the interconnections between them are so strong that I think that's the other part we can't really escape talking about. Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you both. I learned so much. I'm sure our audience did too. And thank you, Stefan, or should I say doctor,
Yes,
for
Dr.
joining
Kermit,
us.
yes.
But yeah, thank you both so much for myself, from Ava, for our audience. We so appreciate it.
Thank you.